I'd never even heard of Madison, Wisconsin.
It's a nice college town, but I mean, not a lot to do there.
It was far enough away where it was like away.
The Cramps would stop only in Wisconsin long enough to try and scoop up some ashes from Ed Gein's burned down house.
Starting a studio when Butch and Steve started a studio was unheard of.
What's going on in that building across the street?
We just made it up as we went along, really.
Killdozer is the sound of smart studios and the sound of the Midwest.
What are you listening to? He's like, this band's Smashing Pumpkins. And I'm like, why are the drums so loud?
When Gish came out, people were comparing it to the Black Crowes.
What the fuck is he doing? He's like, well, he hasn't finished the Smashing Pumpkins record. And like, the who?
Well, you can never know if something like that's going to happen. You know, a band like Nirvana.
Everyone thought I had some magic button I could push and turn them into a superstar grunge band.
We're connected by this thing that changed our lives profoundly forever.
Pretend You're Dead comes on the radio, and I'm like, wish somebody would make me sound like that.
But at the time, he was just some schmo up in Madison.
100% of your commitment and your relationship was with the sound.
If the band doesn't feel comfortable, it's not going to be right.
It's hard for a lot of people to understand, but you lose money.
The equipment doesn't make the record, ever.
If just being here was possible, then we wouldn't have had to close.
They went outside their box, I think, to make it happen for us.
What they have in common is they're both so easygoing.
We couldn't go to a single town, I think, in America when we were touring, where there wouldn't be somebody who leapt out of the woodwork, who they'd worked with. I mean, it was crazy.
It is the name from that era. It is the one studio. There is no other.
There was some kind of geeky appeal from early on in my life about recording stuff and listening back to it. I had 2 cassette decks back home in New York when I was a kid, and you could take one of those and record a drum beat onto it, and then hold that speaker up to the microphone and play it back as you recorded, say, a guitar. I didn't know it at the time, but I guess I was trying to multi-track, even back then as like a 10-year-old kid.
You're a kid, waiting for something to hit you in the head and offer you a clue on what you're supposed to do.
I was probably in 8th grade when I asked my parents for a cheap tape recorder. I started recording albums, dubbing them onto tape, and then editing them into new sequences because it was something that I could control and manipulate. It seemed like there was this whole possibility of being able to change things. It was really cool. When I first met Steve, he had a 4-track in his apartment on Broome Street.
So I had a reel-to-reel tape deck, which was really hi-fi, that I bought with money I got from mowing lawns in the summers.
I used to go over to Steve's apartment, and before we would start recording, we would go downtown to the Plaza Bar and buy these dirt cheap pitchers of beer and drink beer until bar time, and we would get a hell of a buzz on. And then we would look at each other and go, let's get smart. That meant let's go back to his apartment, plug in guitars and drums, and start rocking on his 4-track until the sun came up. To be honest, neither Steve nor I are very proud of the fact that that's where we got our name.
It really was more about the recording of it. That's what was fun. And the songs were just kind of something we made up to have something to record.
We We had no gear there. We had like 4 microphones. I think he had a PV mixer. We ran everything through the Space Echo. It didn't matter if it was vocals, drums, guitar. So everything had this sort of murky, Cramps-style slap echo on it, which actually sounded kind of cool.
There were the people in the big cities that made records that went in the record stores, and here it was more like we just wanted to have something that we could give to our friends, and maybe if it was really cool, sell for $5 down at the record store.
The way you found out about other scenes in other cities was really word of mouth. And a lot of that happened from touring bands. They would come through and play a gig at one of the local all-ages shows. You know, there'd be like 5 or 6 bands playing in the afternoon at some funky little space.
There was so much influence going on nationwide from obscure places like Madison, Wisconsin, or Minneapolis, or Seattle. I mean, those were backwater places.
There were 2 things that really influenced us back then. One was what you heard about from other people. And the other thing was like reading The NME and Melody Maker, finding out about bands who were from the UK kind of doing the same thing that we were all trying to do in the Midwest. Our music was like a weapon.
There was coverage just through fanzines, really. Flipside, Maximum Rock and Roll. Those were fanzines, but they were also national, so you could get those at any punk record store in the country.
You would hear about people, but sort of from a great distance. And even if you had the records, you had no context by which to even understand what it meant.
It was a very counter-cultural way of living for bands back then, because I think they were rejecting mainstream music and also, to a certain extent, rejecting mainstream lifestyle of living.
You couldn't escape it. I mean, everywhere there was a poster with Ronald Reagan with a huge penis coming out of his ear or something, you know, that Reagan was doing.
Ronald Reagan was a good target for punk rock.
The Midwestern music scene over the last 40, 50 years has made a significant contribution to world music, but because we don't control the media in the Midwest, our musical contributions often get overlooked.
The media centers are in LA and New York, and they love examining themselves and ignoring the rest of us, and they never want to admit that, you know, guess what, guys? Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't from New York.
A lot of friends on the coast think we live in the tall pine trees, like the Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House in the Big Tall Woods, and that we don't have sidewalks.
Most of the people in the Midwest have a working class mentality. Your families are all working class. Your grandparents were working class, in most cases immigrant class.
It's easy to go to that cliche about hard working. You know, that's not true at all, really. I met some of the laziest shits I've ever met are from the Midwest.
We don't grow up going to school with, you know, the guy from Toto's Kids. You know, we might know, oh yeah, my third cousin played in, you know, the guy from Cheap Trick's side project. That was about as close as you came to anything. We're Americans, but we know we come from other places, and how the fuck did we end up in the cornfield kind of thing, you know? I remember asking Butch where he came from, and we were like, where? What? What city? The Vidalia or some whatever? Huh? Yeah, exactly. See, I know it's a V. Viroqua.
There were always cool bands here. In some cases, those bands really only played right around the area. You know, they didn't go to New York or the West Coast. They played in Chicago or Minneapolis or Milwaukee. You know, it was sort of this little scene and where you could find enough gigs to play around here to make a living.
You learn pretty quick that if you didn't really work at it and tour, you know, to get out of the Midwest would be a chore, basically, because I think you were overlooked pretty readily.
All we really cared about was that we could add another town to our sort of 6-hour radius dream that we had. St. Louis to the south was included in that. Maybe Lawrence, Kansas was a little bit further away, but everybody wanted to play Lawrence because it was a college town.
That was huge to get out and play, and then to have actual audiences that were into it.
Are you bored? Do you feel you're missing out on something? There must be more to life than slaving away, raising a bunch of whining brats and groveling in church.
The coasts are really about money. They really are. And in the Midwest, it's never really been about the money because you didn't need that much money here to stay alive, and you could focus on the other stuff.
Being in the Midwest, you're sort of left to your own devices, and because of that, bands in particular would sort of come up with their own unique spin on how they wrote songs and how they performed them and what kind of sound they were going after. Like Die Kreutzen, who to me were ahead of the pack in a way with a band like Jane's Addiction. You know, they were metal, they were punk, they were glam, they were psychedelic, and they had all of those things sometimes all in the same song. And yet they were Milwaukee.
No one had come up with the term modern rock or alternative rock. It was just college rock, and it could mean everything from Die Kreutzen, which was very heavy, very metal, to the Dead Milkmen, which is kind of like goofy punk music.
A lot of the indie stores not only carried the local music, but they championed it. B-Side on State Street or Mad City Music, Atomic in Milwaukee.
We didn't have coffee shops and tattoo parlors and all that stuff like we have today that you might hang a poster up. Only record stores.
You had that devoted mom and pop shop where those guys really gave a shit. And it was the only place you were ever gonna find new releases from anything underground. That's where everyone met. That's where you put up your flyer, like, need a drummer for, you know, this band. That's where you had to find out where the shows were, what the new bands were, what was happening, you know, walking in there and hearing stuff for the first time.
Bands like The Replacements and Who's Purdue and REM, and they were all doing their own music, putting out their own records, and they were actually getting away with it.
There was a very vibrant do-it-yourself punk rock scene in Madison, like there was in Washington, D.C., New York City, Austin, San Francisco, Los Angeles.
I don't know why, but I feel okay. I feel the darkness turn to day. I don't know why, but I feel like I am taking a ride.
It was like all these freakers in a small town, you know? It's like those are the best situations, I think.
But I feel like I am taking a ride on life.
You kind of just show up at this house and one of your bands would practice at 1, another one of your bands would practice at 3, and like your third band.
There wasn't one particular style that was really sticking out. Like Tar Babies had this sort of groovy punk thing going on. I mean, Bucky Pope is an amazing guitarist and Dan was great in drums, and they had their own kind of sound and style.
The Tar Babies, you know, they were basically the Chili Peppers before the Chili Peppers.
Initially, before hardcore happened, every band that you would have called punk was doing something really unique.
I think that all of us were avoiding being influenced directly. You didn't really want to invade each other's territory.
Our bass player took it upon himself to go and find venues for this to happen, like the Wilmar Center in Madison, or putting it in a public park.
Green Bay had a scene. There was kind of like weird
The Kenosha
fashions.
punks were ones that you did not want to invite to your party.
Come on, they were fine.
Are you ready, Sheila? Mark? You bet. All right then. Let's go.
We all knew each other. We'd play shows together. We'd put on shows together. That was the Madison scene. We played with bands that we'd otherwise have nothing in common with other than, oh, we all practice in the same place. We know each other. Oh, they're great guys. Let's play a show together.
Hey, what's the big idea? The phone would ring and I'd be talking to Dave from Millions of Dead Cops, and he'd say, we're coming through town. We heard that you guys do shows there, and so we'd have to go out and find a VFW hall or a bar or something, like physically go out and walk the streets and find a place to play.
1, 2, 1, 2, yak, check, 1, 2, 2.
There was a vital club scene in Madison in the mid-'80s. There was headliners that got a lot of sort of traditional rock shows. There was bunkies that got more showcase things like jazz and folk music. There was the Club de Washington Okays, which had punk rock. And then Merlin's sprung up on State Street, and Merlin's catered to the whole sort of new wave punk explosion that came out of New York and London. That was like the cool de facto place to go see up-and-coming bands. For some inexplicable reason, Steve Marker got hired there as a security guard. He is the least likely person to be a security guard. He had to like search people when they came in to make sure they weren't bringing anything illegal into the club.
In those days, the drinking age was 18, so it only took a little while for us to be able to play. And there were a couple bars that would book original music. I played at Merlin's with the Tar Babies, and my mom had to come to the show. You know?
I heard bands that in some ways were as cutting edge and maybe almost leading the pack in terms of, you know, sort of new genres of music that were popping up. But because we were out here, no one knew who they were.
We were really expressing music from Madison, at least, or Wisconsin in general. We always tried to have kind of a rural look to our album covers and things like that. And a lot of bands are doing the same thing. Oh, look at Spooner, you know, Spooner, Wisconsin.
I'd been working at Meriter Hospital and got fired for taking home one of the surgery scrub uniforms. Got pissed off. I walked down to Ray Kettner Music on State Street, and there was a wanted ad for a drummer in a band that was recording original music. I called up. It was Duke Erickson. And I had one practice with them, and they called me the next day and said, do you want to join our band? The band started writing a lot of original music, and I wanted to record it.
We really didn't know anything about making a record, but we figured it out. We just decided we were going to go and record in a studio these songs. And we rehearsed them like crazy and just went in and laid them down. And just did it all on our own dime. Designed the covers ourselves, stuffed the records ourselves, and put them on sale, whoever would take them. It somehow legitimizes you in people's eyes when you actually have a record.
Boat was just Spooner's label, and we were all involved. Duke was very involved in the design of the jacket. Butch was very involved in the recording and mixing of the music.
It was just our own label, but I think people thought we actually had a deal, you know.
To me, it was a learning experience about how to actually make drums sound good and make guitars sound good and to mix a record. But the whole time I kept thinking, we can do this ourselves. And rather than saving up our money and going into these studios, what if we just bought our own gear? And at that point, Steve Marker was our roadie, and he had been to some of the sessions that we've been recording in other studios. And somehow, I don't really know where that conversation took place, Steve and I decided, let's actually open up our own recording studio. It probably happened at the Plaza after we drank 3 or 4 pitchers of beer. The very first space that we moved into, the Gishel building on East Wash, was this giant warehouse, and we rented about a 900 square foot, maybe 1,000 square foot space on the second floor. we felt like there were no rules. You know, we really felt like we're just gonna go find bands or bring them in and start recording them. We went to the Mazo Egg Company out in Middleton and bought 1,000 egg flats for $50. And then Steve and I and our friends super glued them to the walls, all 1,000 of them.
They'd get maybe one 6-pack of beer and a bag of some potato chips, and then call like 20 people and say, "We have beer and chips. Why don't you come over and help us out with our cool new recording studio?" And so people would go over there and there'd be no beer and there'd be no chips.
I applied many egg cartons to the walls of Gisholt. That's right. I was actually a carpenter at that point, I believe. Or was I? No, I wasn't. Was I?
The control room in the original studio in Gisholt was pretty bad. It was a small L-shaped room with a tiny little window to look out into the tracking room. Acoustically, a nightmare. We inherited that space when we went in there. There was never any acoustic design, but that room really did suck.
We were the first band to record at Smart in, I'm saying, 1982.
The glue on the egg cartons was still drying when Tar Babies came in to do their first session. Didn't smell very good. We were wiring like the last 48 hours before they came in to start the session. Steve would wire something and we'd start listening to it. Go, sounds pretty good, right? And I'd look at him and go, yeah, I think it sounds pretty good. But we weren't quite sure, you know. Those first couple years, the recording chain we had was so crude and lo-fi that I don't think it would have mattered if we had a really hi-fi sounding control room.
Are you ready to rock?
It was good timing when we started Smart because there was a scene bursting in Madison of all these indie bands that also had a do-it-yourself spirit and did not care about getting signed to a major label. They wanted to record a 7-inch 45 and put it out on Bone Air Records or whatever one of the local labels were. A lot of them had barely practiced enough to even learn their craft on their instrument, but it didn't matter. You know, they wanted to write a song and make a noise and capture that. Steely Dan wasn't coming into Smart Studios. Mech Mensch and Killdozer and Tar Babies were coming in, and they were raw, scruffy, grungy, dirty-sounding bands.
We got some CDs and T-shirts to sell. You can sign our mailing list. Come talk to us.
It was big. Ceilings were low. There might have been a piano in there.
We had the run of the whole building, so we were able to put up mics kind of anywhere down the hallways, in the ceilings. You know, there wasn't anybody around at night.
In one room was this artist who I just read about named Dennis Neckbottle.
We kept the same hours, you know, start late, work late, and carry on, you know. So, and it was exciting, new energy, more interesting energy than another artist coming up there. And it was active, and so I was quite excited.
If you were out in the street, you could hear whoever was playing there. We were lucky that across the street was just a big parking lot, so we never really got any complaints from anyone around there. There were no residences in that block.
You know, a lot of professional acts might have complained about the lack of soundproofing, but we kind of considered things like squealing bus brakes and diesel truck engines roaring because there was a red light right outside. But, you know, that just adds some good ambience.
Remember how long it took to get to the bathroom from the studio?
If you had to take a pee, you had to go out through the control room, take a right, go down the hallway, and it was probably about 300 or 400 feet all the way to the end of the building.
So we would bring our skateboards, because it would take you a few minutes to walk down there and back, so we would just be like,
If you're drinking a lot of beer.
yes! And we thought that that's what rock people did.
Butch was driving cab, and I was just trying to do Smart, and we get people to come in, and I think it was $25 an hour. We gave away a lot of hours.
We were making no money. Steve couldn't even afford to pay his rent, so at one point he moved out of his apartment on Space Street and literally moved into the studio, and there was like a closet back in the boiler room, and he just threw all his clothes in there, and he was sleeping on the floor at night. So He would never leave the studio. And about every 3 or 4 days, he'd go, Butch, can I go use your shower? Every penny that we made, we would save up and buy another microphone, or we would go to these rummage sales and see if we could find something, you know, oh, here's another pair of headphones, let's see if they work, you know, we would buy them for $5 or $10.
We weren't trained professionals. We just were reacting to the era where you had to have the guy in the disco suit and with the Coke spoon telling you how to produce your records.
You know, we just said, screw that, we're going to do it ourselves and just figure it out.
They were our friends. We trusted them. Just by using them as our base to record, gave us a better product, and we didn't sound like crap like we could have, you know.
We'd be staying up all night making these crazy records, and then to actually get a piece of vinyl that you could take down to the record store and they would sell it was really exciting.
I never thought of it for them as being a hobby because they were there all the time. One could think it was a clubhouse.
Anybody could walk through the door and record. They didn't have to always have money. If they had money, great. If they didn't, we usually figured out a way to make it work. There was no sign on the door. They just showed up.
Okay, the first song I'm gonna do is a 1904 hit, which is a very, very famous one. Give my regards to Broadway, remember me at Herald Square.
One of the most intriguing and interesting characters to ever grace the studio is Madison's The Singing Irishman.
He literally went around town collecting cans, and then he would take them to the recycle center, and I think he did that enough to where he got about $20 together, and he came and knocked on our door, said, I would like 1 hour of recording time, please.
Thank you.
Of course, we spent a lot more time than that, but I think we only charged him for the 1 hour.
There once was this balloon man from the windy city of Chicago, selling his balloons of all different colors.
The Singing Irishman was a big part of what made this studio unique because he was completely and truly original.
I've been at it for over 40 years, and I love it. I sing whenever inspiration hits me.
Butch and Steve were way ahead of the curve in the fact that even though they were musicians, they didn't stop themselves from getting their hands dirty with the gear. A lot of musicians had enough problems getting their hands dirty with the instruments.
They didn't adhere to the typical way of making records. Reason one, we were willing to try anything, and reason two was we didn't exactly know what the typical way was, except from what little experience we'd had in other studios.
Bands were willing to let me experiment, and then it was a learning curve for me and sometimes for the bands too.
My first recollection of Smart was just how he was able to conjure like an actual sound out of us who weren't that skilled. He was very accommodating and very excited about our music, and that was kind of contagious.
The only thing that Smart got increasingly better at doing, Butch and Steve, was making their ideas sound better.
Whether it be The Weeds, Honor Among Thieves, Swamp Thing, and we played so many shows with them, and eventually they all had, the center point was that they were connected to Smart.
We had reggae bands, we had country western bands, we had punk bands. It wasn't just a punk scene. It was a very healthy place to be for everybody, other than the drinking.
Steve and I were possibly the two stupidest businessmen to walk the planet. We didn't know anything about marketing, how to successfully run a real business. We just wanted to have a studio open 24/7 where we could go and record music. That's all we cared about.
There's no business model. That's an understatement. Listen, if you came in and you had a few $100, boom, we'll record you. And there never was money here. And of course, that never was what it was about.
And we finished up with Fun with Atoms and Killing You. We're here with Steve Marker and Butch Vig of Smart Studios, the big honchos, as they say.
Hot honchos and W-O-R-T. We wanted to get some of the artists who were coming through Smart exposure, and there was no way, there wasn't a chance in hell that they were going to get any commercial airplay. Harry Ragg had a cool new wave punk show, and he was a massive record collector. And I would listen to his show to hear new stuff, especially he was really into the British invasion, whatever was coming out from the UK.
The show that I did was New Needles, and it was a new music show. It was Wart's only new music rock and roll show, so we were really carrying the banner for what new music was coming up. And one of the things that I really carried on was encouraging local bands to submit cassettes, and then we'd play them on the radio, and some were truly awful, but some were really good. They got their exposure, and they'd call up and tell their friends to listen, so it's kind of a secret way to get more people to listen to the show.
Steve and I had the idea, why not put together like a show, like an hour-long show, and we'll feature the best stuff that we've done in the last month. Not even the best stuff, but the most interesting bands that have come through.
They had some names that people would recognize, like the Appliances doing a song about the Packers, and who knows what cover they were coming up with. And then there'd be these really strange bands that were basically Butch goofing around and just giving them a dumb name like Nurble Knurble or Rectal Itch. And so you didn't know which ones were legit and which ones were just fun.
The DJs, the people who worked there were really pulling for us and pulling for the bands we brought in. I mean, they were all excited to do that kind of show too, because they were all interested in new music and wanted to hear whatever was bubbling up from the underground.
Do we have anything new coming out in vinyl that you've recorded down there?
Oh, lots of stuff. We have the new Fun with Atoms album will be out probably in about 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Other kids have a new EP that will be in the... We got a notice from our landlord that we had 30 days to vacate the Gishold building. And that felt like a blessing and a curse, because I think Steve and I felt like we had started to outgrow that space. Luckily, the space across the street had been vacant for several months. So we called the landlord, and he said, I would love to have you guys in there. And a few days later, we moved everything across the intersection of East Washington to 1254. I think by about 4 a.m., we had pretty much pulled everything out of there. So when the landlord came around at 8 o'clock the next morning, it was a mess, you know. We left all the egg cartons on the wall. We let him deal with that. I think I knew that I wanted to get seriously into recording when we started doing some of the Spooner albums. I had gotten very frustrated with some of the recording sessions I'd done when we first went to some major studios to record.
Butch was going to real studios and making real records, you know, that were actually going to come out on vinyl on multi-track professional recordings.
Gary Cleve from Shoes was the guy who said to me, I can tell you're interested in the studio. I think you're more than just a drummer. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think that's one of the things early on that sort of prompted me to want to take control and be able to learn how to do it yourself.
I think it was really life-changing for them because they got exposed to all these different things, and I think Butch came back and was like, we've got to do this here.
I'm waiting to take that long walk.
1254 East Washington was one damn ugly-looking building. It was a 2-story red brick pile of junk, and it looked like a crack house. It looked like a crack house. When we moved into 1254, we had a lot of acoustic experts telling us what we needed to do, and at some point we just decided, screw it, we're just gonna do it ourselves.
Tell me where we draw the line.
I couldn't believe how lucky we were to have a real studio in Madison. I mean, a real studio. Not, you know, tell the dog to be quiet because we're going to overdub now.
I think they'd come into their own when they, moved out of the unair-conditioned warehouse space and bought their own building and could set it up exactly how they want.
Walk this way.
This is where a lot of it happens.
Right in here?
No.
That's some wild stuff, I tell you.
I don't know how much money they spent on building that studio, but it couldn't have been a lot. Smart had like industrial carpeting, bland white walls. It looked like somebody just sort of threw it up in a day. It was very roughly done, and there were all these weird angles, and it was deafeningly loud. It was so loud, it was uncomfortable.
I'm a fool for romance. I'm a fool for romance.
We always wanted bands to feel like whatever they needed to get done, we would help facilitate that. And whether they needed other session players to come in, there's always a great local supportive community of other musicians and artists in Madison who would, at the drop of a hat, come in and play drums or sing backup vocals or put down strings or piano or whatever it was. They were friends of ours, you know, so it was like a no-brainer to call them. They'd be here in 20 minutes.
I always keep a steel guitar and an accordion in the trunk of my car. Especially in wintertime, it weighs down the back end. I had rear-wheel drive, and it was hard to get through the snow sometimes. And a lot of times I'd drop by Smart and, do you have your steel guitar? Of course. And, play on this. Sure. I play on it. Very informal.
There was never any sort of business relationship like that where people said, well, I need, how much money am I going to get paid? That was the last thing that would come out of someone's mouth. They didn't really care about that. They just wanted to come down and play on the session.
You're surrounded by people you know, friends. It was no big deal. It was very, very easy, very enjoyable. Never was I nervous. Never did I feel pressure.
It didn't have that studio clock, sterile doctor's office thing going on. You're here, let's get it done. Let's make it right. Let's make it happen. It was a collaborative thing.
Bands were coming from Milwaukee, they were coming from Chicago, Minneapolis, unloading a station wagon, unloading a U-Haul, unloading a van. I mean, there's all these people showing up in, different states of existence.
Sure, let's go record a CD. Okay, let's go. Sounds like a good day for rock and roll.
Barely alive, half of them,
You pull up in the van, you're on a nondescript street, there's nothing around. There's a bar next door with some food. You load your crap out, maybe somebody from the studio comes and grabs your stuff. It was an innocent time in that you had no understanding other than you just had to get something done.
When bands came into Smart, they were able to shut the rest of the world out and just focus on making music. And I think that's one of the reasons that people love to come there.
There wasn't anything to think about at Smart except for the sound, the old style machine, and the grilled cheese sandwich, right? I mean, and that was it. I mean, that was all you needed to think about to get through the day because that was all there was.
I vividly remember the soda machine that had the special thing where it would dispense beer. that was nice. We liked that. If they would have let us, we would have slept there. So they were like, no, I'm sorry, you can't stay here.
I was always amazed at how intimate it is, like, instantaneously. You're working with people really closely with something that's very important to them. It becomes close really fast. I don't know you, I'm gonna behave for a little while, and then, oh, that's stupid. And then it just all goes out the window when you turn into yourself, and they are themselves, and everybody's a little crazy, and you're there all the time with each other. So all the barriers are broken down super fast. So it's hysterical and wonderful. And then they leave.
We always kind of hung out in the neighborhood. When bands would come in from out of town, we would make a point of taking them to the local taverns around there. Right across the street was the Friendly Tavern.
Jan's Friendly Bennett.
In the state of Wisconsin, there literally is a tavern on every corner. It's expected. The Friendly filled that role. It was a tavern on the corner.
With some of the bands, if they needed backing vocals, we would just go over to the Friendly. Who's around? Hey man, you want to come and sing on a song right now? And sometimes Marty, the bartender, and whoever was sitting around in there would just put down their beers, and we'd march across the street and go, okay, here's the song, here's the back vocal part. We need a good gang vocal, and it would take 10 or 15 minutes. So we go, okay, thanks, man. And they would all march back to the Friendly.
Butch was the first one to say, if things got to a tense spot or we were getting a little stuck on something, maybe it's time for an ice cold Frosty, I think were his words.
I remember when we finished that Young Fresh Fellas record, Scott sent me like a 7-inch, and I took it across the street to the Friendly. For a while, the most played single on the Friendly's jukebox was Sitting on a Pitchfork by Young Fresh Fellas.
I never knew the sun could shine all night and day. Hey, 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 hey.
We never really wanted to get away from that clubhouse feeling, but I still wanted to make records that would be ambitious and adventurous, but could get played alongside anything else on the radio and sound just as good.
Butch would send me Smart Party tapes, and they were amazing. They had that sound that became huge 5-6 years later.
It was the Smart sound, and it's the Butch Vig sound. Overall, it's smart.
It was dirt cheap in the Gishwell building. But moving into 1254, we realized we sort of had to take the business side a little bit more seriously, and Steve and I were always terrible businessmen, so basically it just meant we got to keep this place booked.
Moving, expanding, spending some money, you know, 2 guys are running it. They probably need a little bit of help. So I went over and I said, well, I want to work here. And they said, well, we're not really hiring anybody, but you know, you want to bring a band in or something, you know, that'd be cool. So then I brought this band in a few days later, and I managed to make it happen, and I was in. They just started throwing everything at me.
During those years there, it seemed like there were just ideas flowing all the time. A lot of ideas, a lot of creativity every time you walked in the door.
For the percussion, Butch suggested that we use beer bottles. And so we went through 24 beer bottles. This is before sampling. And I remember standing there with my headphones on, and breaking beer bottles and wearing gloves so I wouldn't get shards of glass out of my fingers.
I remember one time we drove 90 miles with this orchestral chimes in the back of a pickup truck, and it was about a 200-pound unit with damper pedals, and we hauled it up 3 flights of stairs, and just to hit one chime, you know, it was really stupid.
Exploding star sound to get us in the depths of a star from out in space. Banging on the reverb plate.
We threw rocks at buckets that had bottles.
Take a drum machine and run it through a cheap guitar amp and record that, stick it all together on a tape, chop it up, loop it together.
Steve had, not only did he have a method, whatever he recorded that you did, he would slice and dice and reuse, and it was very modern at the time. It's so easy to do now in the digital world. Steve was doing that back then.
Steve, what's on deck?
Steve and I went to South by Southwest one year, and we took cassettes to give to people, you know, basically trying to, you know, give them to anybody we met from an indie label or a cool band. Would say, hey man, come and record at our studio. We'd love to have you there.
It was the first time we started forming relationships with some of these indie labels that led to so much work that we did later on.
A lot of the indie labels are influenced by the people who start them, like, you know, the guys at Sub Pop Jonathan and his partner. Corey Rusk at Touch and Go, it's very much the bands that he likes, that's who he wants on his label. He wouldn't necessarily sign something because he would think, oh, I can sell 50,000 copies of this.
Enter the 49 gates of uncleanliness!
We'd heard about Smart Studios from, I think it was Robin Davies and Bucky Pope from the Tar Babies. They had said there's this cool new studio. It's being run by the guys who are in this band Spooner. They were very good, but we were trying to be punk, or we thought we were punk, and we thought that we were really sort of hardcore and gnarly.
Enter the 49 gates of uncleanliness, said she, hoisting up her skirt.
Our biggest concern was just that Butch and Steve knew how to record, that they were professionals.
We ended up being shocked at how cool they were and how good they were and how great the sound was.
At the time, they were very affordable.
There were no rules with Kill Those or no commercial expectations, and Corey at Touch and Go would just say, You guys do whatever. You've got a week. That's what we have in the budget, and that's what we would do.
Before he recorded with us, he actually sort of thought about things that he wanted to do, which is sort of nice because, you know, we all thought, well, that's great, sure, what the heck.
Knowing that we could work it out in the studio and Butch would have some ideas just was the excuse for our being lazy.
You guys would just go, cool, man. Whatever you want to do. So it was like, I go, what if we did this? What if we flipped the tape, ran this little drum fill backwards, and then we'll run some backward reverb onto your voice mic, and then we'll come back out, we'll do a blunt cut to a song at a completely different tempo. They're like, that sounds pretty cool. Let's try it.
That means we can each have a beer while you're setting it up.
That's right.
We thought of him as the fourth Killdozer.
I always looked forward to making the record so much. Case in point, one of the bands I was in, Firetown, we did a record on Boat, local label, put it out, did well. We got signed to Atlantic, and then the thing that happens with so many bands getting signed to a label, it was like everything bad happened. Our management team split up. The A&R guy who signed us left. We had to go in the studio with a producer who we did not like at all. It cost a fortune, and we were in New York for like 4 months or 4.5 months. And the day I got home, we started 12 Point Buck. And I was like, I'm free. I'm free.
Lupus took a life of Flannery O'Connor. She wrote many books before death came upon her.
Butch was excited we were coming in again. He said he wanted to make this his White Album. And I'd rather it be the White Album than the Sgt. Pepper's album.
I remember we went to a bar a couple blocks from the studio the day before we were going to start recording, and Mike was like, well, we don't really have any songs. We've got some riffs and things, and I've got a few words. As we drank more and more beer, we started writing things down like stock market reports, radio broadcasts, tuba, accordion, disco.
The spinning of a six-shooter. We better use that on something.
Let's get the sound of a toilet flush. Tin can, firecrackers, guns.
Trumpets, tuba, baritone horn, like I said, accordion, a dog. When we needed something to sound like a fist fight, he said, well, you know, if you punch a head of iceberg lettuce with your fist.
Damn, we got them all into the record.
We did, including the radio, the farm reports.
Farm reports,
which, Butch got up at, you got up at crack of
like
dawn to record the farm reports about, you know, corn futures and pork bellies.
Range from 68 to 70-50. And slaughter cows were generally steady, boning
When Sub Pop first approached Butch to do some production for them, it was the Killdozer 12 Point Buck album that caught their attention, the way that album sounded.
People started really taking notice, and they were like, this sounds awesome. Who did it? Where did they do it? And that was better advertising than anything else we could have done.
I had no idea who was hearing it or not hearing it. And then all of a sudden to realize that it sort of reached its tentacles out and was filtering all around the country, it was cool, man.
Killdozer was one of those bands that really shaped the musical identity of Seattle. They were a universally respected and beloved band. Their sludginess and sense of humor was inadvertently absorbed into the Seattle sound.
There were these little fires. And it was sort of around 1989 that I started to notice the little fires sort of getting brighter. Of course, you had Sonic Youth in New York getting to be more and more nationally known. You had Jane's Addiction's first album coming out in Los Angeles. Right there towards the end of the 80s, you had this glimmer that there was something happening.
Madison, Wisconsin, you're in between Minneapolis and Chicago, which in the era of time that we're talking about both had pretty vital scenes. Seattle was a universe unto itself.
Seattle was really insular, and a lot of bands didn't come up here on tour or anything because it was too out of the way. If you left Seattle, usually as a musician or a band, it was to move to LA or New York or something to make it, you know, to take your music somewhere. It was felt that you had to leave Seattle to do that.
know that I was really aware of a Seattle sound other than the Sub Pop singles collection that Dave Ben from Madison Music was bringing by to check out. That's where I first heard bands like Mudhoney, Nirvana, Tad.
We wanted to do all these records because we were fans of all these bands. We didn't have the money. So by creating a subscription series, we had people finance the Singles Club. We didn't see it from an industry perspective. We didn't go, these bands are all gonna get signed and make millions of dollars. We were like, fuck yeah. That was what it was all about.
Two bands, Die Kreuzen and Killdozer. There's Butch in the middle, and it's part of both of them. That's the sound. That's what Seattle people were coming here to get.
You're listening to WRT. We are here with members of Nirvana playing in town last night at the Club Underground.
And what an awesome show it was, too.
Along with fellow Sub Pop members, Tad.
Big guy.
The big guy. So how's it been recording with Butch Vig?
Exciting, fabulous. Do y'all have anything else to say about your record that's going to come out in September, I think, is it?
If you like Faith No More, don't buy our record.
What if you don't like Faith No More?
You'll have a chance of liking us.
When I joined the band, they had this demo that sounded amazing. It sounded huge, and it sounded different than the things that they had done before, and everyone talked about Butch, 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 Butch.
There was something bright and explosive about his recordings, an interesting juxtaposition, seeing as the bands at the time were coming up from a decidedly murkier place.
There's this buzz about the band because everyone is bootlegging the Smart sessions.
After I mixed Nirvana's Sub Pop sessions at Smart, I sent the tapes to Jonathan at Sub Pop and to the band, and the band pressed up 100 cassettes and sent them out to their friends. They ostensibly DIY bootlegged their own material. Thurston Moore got a copy, passed it on to Geffen Records, and all of a sudden the band was in a major label bidding war.
You know, record companies used to be a sort of a gatekeeper. The flood of material would flow to them. They would pick through it and say, this is worthy, this isn't. And then some percentage of that, probably 5 or 10% of that, would then become like the big name stuff.
You had retail space owned by major labels, radio time bought by major labels, and everything that indies would do was an insurgency that was usually short-lived.
Somebody suggested that we should work with this guy called Butch Vig, who was up in Madison, Wisconsin, and had his own studio.
I got a call, and they said there's this band from Chicago who are great. They're kind of psychedelic, kind of rock, and they're really amazing live. When they came up to the studio, you know, I hadn't seen a picture or anything of them, and it was just sort of like, wow, they look cool.
We went looking for tone. I mean, drum tone. We had heard those Die Kreuzen records, the Killdozer records, and that was big news back then as far as, you know, drums, density, bass, guitar. I mean, there was some real cool things going on sonically.
This was the first time we were working with like an indie producer in his home studio, doing things his way. It was all a world totally, completely beyond us. And that formed the relationship between Butch and I about what he thought the Smashing Pumpkins would sound like and what I thought. And we sort of found this nice balance, which you can kind of hear on that first single, which is Tristessa, and the back is called La Dolly Vita.
The Smashing Pumpkins getting a record deal with Caroline, wow. Somebody at a big record company in New York figured out that this band is great. Like, that's the most amazing thing ever.
When we went in to make Gish with Butch, we knew what we wanted to sound like, but we knew we wanted a really clear version of it. We spent a tremendous amount of time sort of hitting the exact right sound. So the exact right drum sound, the exact right bass sound, and the exact right guitar sound.
I wanted to make great sounding records, and I think it was the first time I felt a kinship with someone who really wanted to go the extra mile and was willing to take the time and hopefully patience to do that.
Once we started making the Gish record, we immediately went into a level of perfection that neither one of us had ever experienced in this situation like that.
I met my match in Billy Corgan. He pushed me as hard as he could, and I pushed him right back.
We had a song called Rhinoceros, where the chorus is, she knows, she knows, she knows. I sang She Knows for 8 hours, punching in every she knows. And then we'd get it, and I'd think we were done, and I'd sit down, and he'd go, I think, buddy, we could fix that. And it was like,
we never really compromised at all in terms of what we wanted to do. It's like, there's no like top 40 commercial songs on that record.
Together, we sort of formed this partnership of trust to really push ourselves to another level. I didn't realize I was working with a world-class producer. I just thought I was working with somebody who I got along with really well. I remember sitting in what was the de facto office with him, and he gets a call from, I guess it would have been Geffen. Kurt Cobain had said that he wanted Butch to produce the record, and Geffen said no. And the only way Butch could work on the record is if the other guy would be the key producer and Butch would be sort of the secondary producer, and Butch was on the phone saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And so he hangs up the phone, and we have this whole conversation. Do you think I'm an idiot?
I hadn't recorded with them yet, but the guys had, and Kurt and Chris were like, well, let's just do it with Butch. What are we thinking? He's the greatest.
Only wants a cracker.
He took two guys, and Kurt and Billy, who were from the basement. They were writing about being alienated and about being, fucked with. And Butch took their rage and their alienation and their incongruity with the world and loaded it into this giant guitar and drum-filled cannon and said, fuck you.
The day hair bands died. The day that no one returned hairband phone calls anymore. That day has a lot to do with right here.
I remember being at the studio and the Spin magazine arrived with Nirvana on the cover. We all were just staring at this cover like we couldn't believe our friends Nirvana or another band from the underground was on the cover of Spin magazine.
The reason that band was so fucking great was a certain percentage or a certain chunk of their being was new.
It was that weird punk rock guilt conflicted intention. We want to make an album that everyone will think is a masterpiece, but we don't want to be the biggest band in the world. But we do. But we don't. But we do. But we really don't. But we did.
Nevermind's out, and we were with Butch the day that it went to #1. He just looked like somebody who'd woken up in a weird dream. He couldn't believe that he was the producer of the #1 record in the world. And we were congratulating him, and you could just see him wrestling with, like, what does this mean? Because very much part of Butch's story was that rock and roll had sort of passed them by. They start this little studio, and they're just gonna kind of make their little indie records, and they're gonna sort of ride off in the sunset, and they're gonna have their beers, and next thing you know,
when you get associated with enough great stuff, it has a magnetism all its own.
Once Butch was successful, people started to say, is there something to be found here? and he had a lot to do with what set up to be a very successful run of the studio.
Smart became ground zero for a moment. Because of the Pumpkins and Nirvana, it was a place where a lot of bands wanted to go record. And all the labels started calling, and management and publishers, everybody wanted to come and book a studio.
He was getting faxes while we were there. It would be like from the manager of the Cult, like offering him $100,000 to do a record or whatever. We were laughing our heads off. It was awesome.
After Nirvana, it was not the same anymore. It stayed casual, but there's just, some money was coming in, and bands who weren't local were coming in, and bands whose names you recognized were coming in.
The Jayhawks, Sunvolt, right into Hey Mercedes, right into Rainer Maria, right into Paris, Texas, right into something else, and it was just literally just work.
We never had a down day, I think, for probably 7 or 8 years.
They'd check in at the Aloha Motel out there, and they'd be here for 3 months.
Record companies shelled out all this money and said, okay, go make a record. And so there was an available kind of funding source for studios and engineers, producers, bands, artists to tap into.
It was like a gold rush mentality. It stopped being about music and art and culture, and it became about getting rich.
We would tour, and the bands that would be opening for us, their concept was, we want to get picked up by some A&R rep from Arista Records or from Columbia.
They wanted that deal. And it was a bad deal, but they wanted that deal. Because that deal meant PR. It meant, oh, God, somebody knows who I am when I drive those forlorn miles in this pathetic van to that next gig. Someone may actually know who we are.
Nirvana didn't just send the tape to Geffen Records. They did it themselves. They put out a single on Sub Pop.
We used to give Butch shit when we would work with him because he'd wear a vest. We're like, what's up with the fucking vest? And he goes, I look a little more official, don't I? It's a little more like, I gotta produce the record. I come to work, I wear my vest over the fucking t-shirt. He wasn't your vision of a rock and roll producer, let's put it. But he did have the vest.
We all knew about Butch Vig, but none of us knew who he was or where he came from. Like, he was just sort of this weird sunglasses-wearing wizard.
He could take a band like Nirvana and make Nevermind. He could take a band like Sonic Youth and make Dirty. And so you have these bands that are teetering on the brink of chaos, and there's a beauty inside there somewhere, and Butch knows how to target that and just yank it out and blow it up.
Killdozer and, the Sub Pop bands were working with Butch. And then, of course, Nirvana was working with Butch. And I think I heard the Nirvana demos.
They were like, do you want to work with us on the next record? It was literally that casual because they were hanging out at the studio with Nirvana.
You could tell the guys working there just were not impressed with us or something. Like, we came in and it was just like, hi. I couldn't figure out if they were intimidated or just quiet or what.
They were crazy. It was just a fun, energized record. And it's a total different energy when you have 4 women feeding off each other in a room and just how they interact.
Tell me about your producer, Butch Vig, and what he brought to the band.
Oh, he's a masturbating animal.
I really try to figure out what the band is trying to achieve and then figure out a way to work with them to get to that level. Everybody I'd run into was, what was L7 gals up to? They had drug dealers coming by the studio, bookies. I don't know how they got involved with bookies.
On one level, he's very comfortable being the guy from the Midwest. He still maintains his Wisconsin accent. He loves his football team. But yet he has a world-class level of talent. The fact that Butch Vig became Butch Vig, nobody knew that at the time. He had a reputation, and you meet him and say, oh, that's the guy? He was more like the guy to come clean your pool or something. Hey, how's it going, buddy?
Baby,
Detroit's in, or bands like Sonic Youth, I'm sure had a love of some sort of pop music, but couldn't really recognize that element in what they do. But Butch managed to find it and say like, oh, it's okay. No, it's okay. Do that 4 times. Don't just do it twice. And simplify and make it sweeter and double that.
Oh, let's try to add a backing vocal. Oh, yeah, let's add another guitar part.
You should try and repeat that or make it more of a chorusy kind of thing.
No, you can do that better. Try it again.
He was able to bring a little bit of that pop passion to those records. Those records rock like hell, but they're really clear.
There's the guitar, there's the bass guitar, there's the drums.
The way that his records were organized, the way that they are trustable and believable makes them durable.
I had heard that Steve Albini used to criticize my production, saying Butch Vig just wants to make every band sound like the Beatles. And there is a little truth to that.
He was never the fast-talking producer. He was never the guy who was going to pump you up for a take or anything like that. He was just very sober, very even-handed, and very steady, very working class.
Butch was one of the first producers to come out of the underground that wanted to turn your noisy garage band into something that the whole world would love.
After the success of Nirvana and Smashing Pumpkins, I started doing a lot of production outside of Smart. I worked with Soul Asylum in Los Angeles, Sonic Youth in New York, the Pumpkins in Atlanta. And what I found frustrating is when I came back to Madison, Smart was booked and I couldn't get into work.
Seattle bands are coming in, all these different bands, and Smart was gaining a certain national notoriety. And Steve and Butch decided one more time to remodel it.
To fix the studio up in some ways that I never dreamed even possible. Finally, we had 2 control rooms that sounded very accurate, and I could hear really well, especially when it came to mixing what was going on. The old design of Smart was almost specifically designed for recording bands live and getting this really, really intense sound. And there had never been any design for those rooms. It was haphazard and it was kind of an out of control sound, but it had a vibe. It had a really intense sound.
I remember we went back up there at some point to do some B-sides after Gish came out, and Butch was all proud. Oh, look, we've got this new design. And it was never the same. It was like they had taken the perfect mistake and tried to make a real studio out of it and made the studio be not what it was, which was very unique. I really regretted that they had gone ahead and done that when they became very official and more of a real studio and suddenly had like stationery and stuff. It felt very opposite of the place that I grew up in.
Couldn't get that out-of-control drum sound anymore. Consequently, I started to spend most of my time in the control room and not in the studio. It became sort of a different approach to recording because it was more experimental and a little bit less traditional. We got an amazing sounding control room, but we lost a little bit of the vibe in the tracking room.
I remember showing up for an interview and it smelled like fresh wood and fresh paint, and everyone was bubbling about the new place, and they needed a assistant engineer, and that was going to be me.
We became a professional studio. We had a lot of people to pay, a lot of gear to pay for. The rates had to go up.
This was right after Nevermind, and that was a big deal for this whole area. Before, Smart was kind of this hidden gem that no one knew about. Suddenly, everybody knew about it, and there's tons of attention.
A humble building putting out some not-so-humble sounds.
We were still trying to be awesome to Wisconsin bands, but if there was a band coming in from overseas or from across the country, they needed to think that this weird little studio in Wisconsin is just as cool or cooler than the LA studios or New York studios that they'd been to also.
Yeah, we'll play that back. That was really good. That was 6, right? Yep. Seems good.
After the success of Nirvana and the Pumpkins and Sonic Youth, I felt like I was getting a bit pigeonholed, and the only kind of records I could make were rock records.
In the middle of Evie's garden.
I started getting interested in other types of music that I wanted to record. One of those artists was Freddie Johnston. I fell in love with his songwriting, and I had to produce him. I had to.
This Perfect World was Butch's first big record at Smart, at the new Smart. Getting to know the new room, getting to know the new studio. It was admirable to see somebody step out of his comfort zone and succeed.
Somewhere in 93, 94, started hearing all this music using samples and just using the studio as the way to make music, not simply using the studio to record a band. There was this phenomenon over in England where if you didn't have a remix accompanying your single, it affected your chances to get in the top 10. Bands like U2, Depeche Mode, there were a lot of bands that were requesting remixes. I think it started with House of Pain. A lot of people who did remixes turned them into a four-on-the-floor dance experience, but we would just kind of rewrite a song. It was through this whole process of using the studio not to record a band, but to just create that spawned the idea for Garbage.
Duke and Steve and I started doing a lot of crazy sonic experiments in the studio, using samplers, filters, tape loops, stomp boxes. Sometimes we would just come up with a crazy idea. I'd get a sound in my head. Why can't the guitar go zhu 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 zhu?
I can't use what I can't abuse.
Yeah, I was in Scotland when I got a phone call. Butch Vig has been inquiring after you. Would you be interested in taking a meeting with him? And I was like, I don't know, who the fuck's Butch Vig? And as far as I was concerned, anyone who was called Butch was worthy of complete disdain. And I expected him to have, like, you know, receding hair and a mullet. I mean, I just thought he would look like a sort of rock saddle. Well, the first time I came to Smart, I was on tour with my band Angelfish, and I was on tour in America, and I took a couple of days off to go and meet the band. They brought me into the studio, and I felt like I was maybe being scammed a little. If the truth be told, I was like, okay, this is not right. Like, there's something really wrong here. Ernie and Mike worked there, and they were all scuttling around in the background and really acting very strange and didn't really take me on much. It was really odd.
I always did my best to do what needed to be done, stay out of the way, speak very little, and if I needed to say something, make sure it was funny.
It was the place where you could shut the doors and feel like everything was safe and we could make music and not be bothered by anybody, and I could stick up posters and pictures and just create a little haven to make music in. It sounded fresh, you know, it came out of a grunge movement where everybody was just plugging guitars in and making a racket, and then we came in and took all these little elements and carefully shoved them and crafted them together.
For so long, this new project was making this record that no one knew about. I was one of the few people who knew what was going on and how exciting it was and how potentially, you never know, but it seemed like it was gonna be pretty awesome.
Garbage being the main client in Studio A or Studio B was a blessing and a curse. We did 4 records there, spread over 10 years, and each record took about a year. But then we would go on tour. The tour took Duke, Steve, and me away from the studio. So Mike had to really hustle to get bands in when we left town. Not a good business model. If you don't have rooms open, bands will look for other studios.
Butch and Steve were not really the managers. They didn't run the studio. They owned the studio, but they were also the main clients of the studio. And there's a lot of levels of complexity that most people didn't understand. We knew what had to happen to keep working. We just had to keep doing it.
What happens in the cycle of a studio is sort of dependent on the success of some of the bands that record there. And this is sort of a never-ending cycle because it keeps bringing in fresh perspectives and new music, and it brings in that do-it-yourself attitude, because whenever something gets popular and becomes the mainstream, there's always going to be a section of people who want to kick against that.
People who would come to Smart would learn about a studio, and they would look around and say, I can put this together too, or I'm going to try and do this myself. Starting their own studio was becoming easier and easier over the years, where I think when Butch and Steve started, no one even knew what a studio was in Wisconsin. There were bills to pay. They were looking for work in video and in commercials, any way to keep the place running and to keep the room full. I remember hearing from a few different people, like, maybe you should get more ad clients and maybe you should do more corporate work. And I knew that that was a possibility and that would be a big change of direction, but I also knew that everybody who liked working there would no longer like working there.
Smart was always this analog beacon to me. Being fresh out of school, it was like kind of the mindset that when you are like a martial artist and if you get your black belt, that's really the beginning of your training. You know, it's not like the end of it. And getting to Smart was really the beginning for me to start my training. And although it's getting cut significantly short for what I was hoping, at the same time, there's just this weird energy in the back of my mind that has a good feeling.
Become a little conduit to your favorite band. So if you walk into Smart like I did, you feel immediately somehow a conduit to Kurt Cobain. That's just what happened in my brain, and I'm sure that happens to a lot of musicians. They step into space and they're like, this is where these amazing records were made. Somehow this gets me closer. Somehow this is one step towards intimacy with these amazing artists. And I think that's why we do claim hallowed ground around certain studios.
It incubated a whole generation, a couple generations of music, not just alternative rock, not just angry, loud rock.
The reason was to make music and the love of records. That's all it was. If we had thought of it as a professional recording studio, it wouldn't have happened.
When Smart finally closed, I didn't feel like, oh, it's the end of an era. I felt like the era had moved on with the culture.
I think that things work in cycles, and the last season was ready to burn out, and it was time for something else, you know?
Smart Studios was never made to be a fucking museum. Smart Studios is about present moment. It's as compelling and critical to the history of recorded music as anything.
Out of this
ugly little brick building in the middle of nowhere, we were able to make something, us and all these amazing musicians, something that reached out and touched the world.
People felt like this was their home, it was their clubhouse. They could get away from the rest of the world, from their record company, from their families if they needed to, whoever, from their crazy boyfriend or girlfriend. They could just come in here and it was a sanctuary to a certain extent. Everybody who worked here was always conscious of trying to make sure that they were taken care of in that way, that they felt like this was a place that was theirs, that they owned that when they were here.
There is something holy about it when you get it right, when you get the synchronicity between the gear and your inspiration and your intuition. There's a lot of magic moments to be had. And it's pretty fascinating when you think of Smart Studios, all the magic moments that happen in this basically little shithole.
Holy Ghost can quite satisfy a woman's soul. I know what a woman craves the most. There ain't no man alive can make a woman as whole as I can. He can. As I can. He can. Yes, as I can. He can. Yeah, I bet it as only I can. Spread your legs, here comes the king. Plug your shirts, cause here comes the king. Lay down in my beanbag chair, I'm the king. And if I should pretty lies, I'm the king of sex. I can make you feel good, baby. Let me show you some loving, baby. Let me show you all my loving.